webinar. Today, our feature is floating offshore wind, and I'm really excited to welcome Olaf, who is the workforce lead for Celtic Sea Power, and also an enterprise advisor working across a number of schools and colleges with the Careers Hub. Over to you, Olaf.
Brilliant, thank you, Carrie. Nice to see you online. I will just get my slides up, which hopefully won't take very long. So, will you share?
Just while you're doing that, just to welcome anyone who's joining now, we've done some introductions, we're recording the session, and Olaf's just about to present to us, so feel free to stay camera off, and we'll join and regroup after about sort of 25 minutes or so, so just enjoy that.
Carrie, just give me a nod, you can see my slides.
Yes, I can.
Fantastic. Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. So I'm going to give a bit of an insight into a sector which is floating offshore wind. So that's the purpose of this session. I'm going to try to condense the information down as much as I can, so I'm not overloading you with information, and I'm hoping that if anyone's got questions, they'll feel confident to come forward and ask questions. I'm happy to expand on anything that isn't covered in the talk. My name is Olaf. I'm the workforce lead at Celtic Sea Power. I've eliminated most of the information from these slides about the company Celtic Sea Power, just to give you some context. It's a company owned by Cornwall Council, so we're a kind of strategic development company doing lots of work to enable offshore wind in the sector. We've got pretty clear objectives, which are to maximise the value from offshore wind and to make sure it happens as quickly and as sustainably and as fairly as possible in the region. So we've got really clear strategic aims that we're trying to cover all around offshore wind and offshore renewables. Our office is in Hale, and we've got a smaller office in Pembrokeshire and Wales as well, but most of our activity happens here in Cornwall. So I wanted to start, if my slides will allow, just with a brief run through and of my own kind of career pathway, my own career journey into the sector, not just for whimsy or to talk about myself, but because I think it illustrates a nice point about where we are in Cornwall with renewables and what the opportunities that already exist can tell us about Cornwall. So I always use this slide when I talk to young people to illustrate that I am from Cornwall and I've had a career in renewables that's been based in and around Cornwall. So I've never lived outside of that red square at the very end of Cornwall. And I've had a number of kind of interesting roles already in renewable energy kind of throughout my career. I always ask young people to tell me about how they've grown up. So I always start by saying, I grew up in Mousehole and St. Just, so there's beautiful pictures there. Idyllic kind of Cornish places that you might not associate with heavy industry. They're more kind of tourist places. But the skills you learn growing up in and around Cornwall are invaluable to offshore wind employers. They literally have a cash value, the kind of skills that we learn in this environment. So jumping in the sea as a child, learning how the sea interacts with different materials, learning about the temperature, the conditions, the types of animals that live in and around the sea. These are all skills now that are embedded in me from such an early age that are now valuable to my employer, and that I go out into the marketplace and I can talk about these things with confidence. That gives me a value to employers, and I learned that by growing up in and around Cornwall. In terms of actual renewables, the first time I really interacted with any type of renewable energy properly was when I went to college at Penwith. So some of you might be familiar with the turbine right up on top of the hill in Penzance. It's quite a prominent feature in Penzance now. It's been there for about 15 years, give or take. So that was the first time I saw a wind turbine and thought, this is pretty cool. I'd like to have something to do with this as a job in the future. I was very lucky. I managed to go and study renewables engineering here in Cornwall at Tremoe campus in Penryn. So they've got a renewables course there. So I didn't have to leave Cornwall to study up to undergraduate level renewables engineering in the county. I then went on to have my first kind of professional renewables job, which was designing solar arrays, so designing commercial solar farms, going up on rooftops with a team of people and installing them. Most of this was on farms in Shropshire and Herefordshire and all across the kind of middle of England. I still lived in Cornwall. I had to travel out of Cornwall to work, which was frustrating, but quite rewarding in its own way. I got to see a lot of England. I got to work on lots of different projects. I always wanted to come back and work in Cornwall, and I was very lucky I managed to do that. So I've managed to get a job now where I'm based in Cornwall, and I don't have to travel to and from every week. I always emphasize as well how much I kind of promote STEM outreach. I cannot kind of talk about it enough, how important it is that I use the skills that I learned in my professional world to try to encourage people to think about science and technology and engineering outside of that. So I volunteer for the National Trust, driving the beam engine at Levant Mine, so the oldest steam engine still working in Cornwall. And I do lots of kind of STEM outreach with young people across the county as well. So I always encourage other people in the sector to try to do that outside of their professional lives as much as possible. So that's a race through just of how I got into my kind of into a role in Cornwall in renewables. The reason I think that's worth talking about is because we don't necessarily appreciate just how important Cornwall is in terms of renewable energy. We're not a marginal part of the mix. We've always been right there at the front of renewables in the United Kingdom. So we had the first onshore wind farm anywhere in the United Kingdom in Cornwall. That was in Delabole, so up near Tintagel, all the way back in 1991. So we were the first site in the United Kingdom to exploit an onshore renewable asset in this way. We've got the first and really the only prominent UK manufacturer of heat pumps, so ground source and air source heat pumps. That's Kenza. Some of you might have heard of Kenza. They're based just outside of Truro, near Through Milestone. So they are at the absolute leading edge of not just of manufacturing the assets, but also of devising the kind of business plans and the commercial aspect of using district heat networks. So they've done amazing work all across England, the United Kingdom and Europe, looking at these projects and how they can commercialize heat pumps as an asset. All of that's based in Cornwall. We've got the first and so far the only commercial geothermal assets. So we've got United Downs, the Eden project, even things like Jubilee Pool in Penzance. So we've got these really cutting edge geothermal projects using heat from underground to generate energy on the surface, which is very encouraging in terms of our local decarbonisation, but also as an export opportunity in terms of the knowledge and the innovation that comes out of Cornwall from that asset. We had the first renewable degree, so the renewables engineering degree. I think they started it in 2003, so they were quite well ahead of the curve. That's not just something to boast about. It's also what it's done is it's drawn knowledge and expertise from all across the country down to Cornwall. For the last 20 years, academics, researchers, professionals have been drawn to that as a kind of an asset in Penryn. So people have come to teach, they've made their lives here, and we've got lots of very knowledgeable people around the renewable energy engineering space because of that degree. We've always had, it's no surprise to anyone, we've always had a very strong marine engineering sector based around traditional industries, shipping, fishing, but then moving into more modern industries. We've actually got cordage companies that are installing, I'd probably say more than half of the existing tidal energy assets in the United Kingdom have been installed by companies based in Cornwall. So the assets themselves are in Scotland, Northern Ireland, north of England, but they've come from companies that are based in and around Cornwall, going out and selling their wares across the United Kingdom. So when we talk about offshore wind and floating offshore wind, I'm talking a lot about a future sector, but that isn't springing up out of nowhere. We've already got all of the seeds that we need in the county to push this sector out into the world. So we're not starting from nowhere. We've always been at the front, and floating wind is just another example of that. We're right at the cutting edge of the next big thing in renewable energy. Just coming back to that turbine once more. So my favorite turbine in the world, the one that made me fall in love with wind turbines. Just to give you an indication of the scale of the turbines I'm now going to start to talk about. Some of you might have seen that turbine. You might have stood next to it in the car park. I used this slide recently at the college just to illustrate the scale. So this is the turbine that is at the college. It's about 40 meters total in height to the tip of the blade from the ground. That's it next to quite a large building. If we want to compare this to an offshore turbine, one of the floating offshore turbines, we'd have to scale it down a little bit. So just to give you an indication of scale, a floating turbine like the ones we're talking about for the Celtic Sea would look like this next to an onshore turbine that we might be used to seeing. They are monumentally big. They're almost indescribably big. So the best way to do it is just to show a picture like this to give some idea of scale. The red portion of the substructure is the part of the turbine that's under the water. That's higher, so that's got a bigger draft. It's about 20 or 30 meters beneath the waterline. That's higher than most buildings that you'd encounter on a day-to-day basis in Cornwall. And that's just the part of the turbine that's under the water. So I won't dwell on this, but just to give you some indication of the scale. And when I start talking about numbers of turbines, it gives you some idea of the challenges around how we're going to get these things out into the water. Again, just to illustrate, that was obviously a diagram. these turbine components already exist. We've got turbines almost as big as this already deployed in the north of England. This is a turbine blade manufacturing facility in Cherbourg. Those are people lined up alongside the blade. They look like this when they're deployed. So this is a floating asset that was deployed in Scotland. Those aren't small boats doing the tow in there. Those are anchor handling tugs and big tugboats. They look like toys next to these assets. They are enormous. And when they're deployed, they look something like this. So these are two projects that were deployed off the east coast of Scotland a couple of years ago, really to pave the way for the industry and to show people that it was possible to deploy floating turbines like this. These two projects were deployed off Scotland. They've been pretty successful. So they have proven that the technology works. It can be deployed at scale, and they've paved the way for the bigger commercial projects that are about to come to the southwest of England. I did give a brief introduction. So CSP is a company, like I said, we're part of Cornwall Council. We're based in Hale. There's about 18 of us, give or take. And the two things we really care about are making sure that this floating wind development happens as quickly as possible so we can start to reap the benefits, and to maximise those benefits in terms of their economic output, but also in terms of their fairness, their environmental status, all the other aspects of development and sustainability that we really care about, to make sure that happens in Cornwall as well as it possibly can, as well as the rest of the region, so the southwest and the United Kingdom on the whole. So that's kind of a little bit of information about the floating assets. It's worth touching on now, kind of what are those economic benefits? So why do we care so much about bringing offshore wind to the southwest? Some of that might be very obvious, but it's worth reflecting on the impact offshore wind has had on the whole in the United Kingdom. We do have a really well-established offshore wind sector. So we've always, well, not always, but for the last kind of 25 years, we've been deploying offshore wind in the United Kingdom. Most of that's happened on the east coast of England and the east coast of Scotland. So these grey blotches in the sea are any existing or in development wind farm, essentially. So anything that's being built or has already been built and has been commissioned. There's a pretty obvious pattern that they're all down the east coast of the United Kingdom. Anyone who's been to the east coast may well have seen one of these. If you've flown out of London over the Thames estuary, you probably look down on some of these wind farms across the Thames estuary. As we'd expect, most of that onshore activity, so most of the sector activity has happened near to where those farms are. So in places like East Anglia, places like Grimsby, Hull, Aberdeen, Blyth, the Port of Tyne. All of these places have kind of grown up around the offshore wind sector quite gradually, quite organically. We've seen growth in economic activity and all of the associated services that kind of feed into the sector. This one example is Grimsby. I was there last year to see this pretty fantastic facility. Grimsby had a fishing fleet, a really prominent fishing fleet, fell on hard times over the last few decades. There was a lot of viable land around the docks that offshore wind developers started to eye up and think we could use that land to service our wind farms. So Ørsted, who are a Danish company, came in and they built this incredible operation and maintenance facility in Grimsby. Now they run their service operation vessels out in and out of Grimsby almost every day on 2-week rotations coming in and out. They employ hundreds of people and they like to boast that most of those people live within an hour's drive of the facility. So they've got this kind of good news success story in terms of routing jobs in the sector in the local area. So that's one nice example would be Grimsby. Across the United Kingdom, the Offshore Wind Industry Council do surveys, they do industry engagement, they try to add up the number of people. There's around 32,000 people as of last year working in the offshore wind sector, either directly or indirectly working on projects in offshore wind in the United Kingdom. The really important part of that is that that's been projected to grow based on the project pipeline that exists. So based on the number of projects that are yet to be built and deployed, there's projected growth about 3 times in the next 5 years. So up to about 102,000 people are expected to be working in the sector. That obviously is a challenge in terms of finding the people. We all talk about skills gaps. We talk about green skills and recruitment issues all the time. It's also an enormous opportunity for anyone looking to move into an interesting, well-paid sector. It's clear there's going to be a huge amount of jobs available for people who are motivated and willing and able to go into that sector to work. So that's the national context. I'm obviously talking about Cornwall and talking about this more local context. At the moment, there's absolutely no wind turbines anywhere near Cornwall. The nearest would be up the channel towards Brighton or north of Wales, in the kind of Liverpool basin there, north of Wales. So why am I talking about offshore wind in Cornwall? Well, the simple reason is because we are about to see kind of industrial development on an enormous scale in Cornwall. At the moment, all of the assets have been built in shallower waters. So this chart shows water depth by color, essentially. So lighter blue is shallower water, darker blue is deeper water. All of those existing assets are very deliberately placed in shallower waters because up until now, we've only had the technology available to deploy wind turbines in shallower waters. So if I flick that back and forth, you'll see the shapes literally perfectly match up against the shallow water assets in the North Sea. So we've exploited the North Sea really well based on the water depth. More recently, we've had this massive innovation in floating offshore wind. So you might have heard the term floating offshore wind. The main distinction, obviously, is that instead of mounting the turbines to the seabed on a monopile, which is limited to a depth of about 50 meters, we can deploy floating assets now at essentially any depth. So in terms of the UK waters, the depth constraint has mostly been eliminated. So you can now look at sites with any water depth and start to think about their other characteristics, the wind resource, the environmental constraints, the seabed conditions. There are still some other constraints, but the depth constraint has mostly been removed because of this innovation into floating structures. What that means is we've opened up these 3 orange sites that have just popped up. So the Crown Estate, who leased the seabed, have identified these 3 project development areas and they've put them out for tender. So just like all the green sites on the East Coast that have been tendered out over the last few decades, there will now be a leasing round, which is currently open, focused just on the Celtic Sea, north of Cornwall, southwest of Wales. So these 3 sites are currently out for tender. They'll be leased to developers at the early part of next year. So we're currently looking at the leasing round, wondering who's going to win these sites and which developers will win the sites. The government target for these 3 sites, so the government and the Crown Estate have said they want up to 4.5 gigawatts of floating offshore wind in these 3 sites, so 1.5 gigawatts per site, up and running in the Celtic Sea by 2035, so in just about 10 years' time. It's worth saying, obviously, to give that some context, 4.5 gigawatts would be about 300 of those giant turbines that I showed you. Each turbine is sat on a floating platform. Each platform has 3 mooring lines. Each mooring line has an anchor the size of a car attached to it. And then we've got all the rest of the balance of plant. So all of the cabling, the infrastructure onshore, all the grid connections, all of the port development that needs to happen to deploy these assets. There's a huge amount of stuff that needs to happen before we get to putting turbines out in the water. But 4.5 gigawatts based on that reference turbine I showed you, that would be 300 of those turbines. They look something like this. So to give you an idea of how they're deployed, this was a test project off the coast of Portugal using slightly smaller turbines. This is the kind of process that's involved. So they're put together on the dockside and then they're towed out to sea using very large ships. When they're integrated on the dock, they look something like this. So this was a project, Kincardine, that went up off of Scotland, one of those early projects off Scotland. They were put together in Rotterdam, so in a European port, and then they were towed up across the North Sea. Obviously, what we're hoping to see in the Celtic Sea is ports more close to home, picking up this work, doing the integration and the tow out from ports across South Wales and the southwest of England as well. The blade manufacturing, this is just another example of the kind of the scale of the blades. So they're manufactured in very large processing plants like this. This is half of a turbine blade with 2 people inside it, just to give you an idea of the scale of the components needed. Thinking about the rest of the system, so not just the turbine, but the mooring lines. This was a study done looking at the kind of requirements for mooring lines for a platform this big. The study came back and said you're going to need chain links that are in excess of a ton per link, so 1,100 kilograms of metal per chain link, which would be about the size of a grown man, looking at the scale of this picture, just to give you an idea of some of the components that are needed. Again, the rest of the system, so beneath the turbine, we've got things like the electrical infrastructure, so that's a cable reel. The bottom 3 pictures are all different types of anchor solution. So the furthest left looks like a suction anchor, so that's dropped onto a soft seabed, and then the air is sucked out of it and it sinks itself into the ground a bit like a bucket in sand. Then we've got a drag embedment anchor, so that is towed across the seabed and buries itself in the seabed. And then on the right, we've got a pin-driven pile-driven pin anchor. So that's driven into the seabed to give stability. We've got things like the mooring solutions. So there's concrete blocks that are used to replace habitats to encourage artificial reefs to develop around mooring systems. So there's lots of interesting work going into the rest of the system, as well as just the turbines and the substructures as well. So this kind of coming on from the technology and the deployment, I've kind of raced through that to talk a little bit about the types of careers that we expect to see in floating offshore wind. This slide is to illustrate, I think, what I've noticed, certainly from my work in careers in offshore wind, which is a dangerous tendency to over promote a very particular type of role. So when we talk about careers in offshore wind, we very often see someone in a high vis hanging off of a turbine offshore doing something exciting. And of course, this is a fantastic way to get young people encouraged and to think about jobs in the sector. I think it doesn't necessarily capture the breadth of opportunity in the sector. So there's lots of jobs that are nothing to do with going offshore. There's lots of jobs that are much more accessible. Lots of people won't be interested in going offshore. It might really put them off the sector to think that they have to go and work on turbines offshore. Some people are much more interested in other elements of the sector that happen before you get to this point. I think there's an enormous amount of kind of PR and political capital in promoting these types of jobs, promoting how exciting the sector is, how dynamic the sector is. I've got a slightly out of date example of that. There's a lot of political currency and capital in kind of promoting these jobs offshore. I know why it's done. It is a really important part of drawing young people and getting people excited about the sector. We've thought about careers in Cornwall and in the Southwest in a slightly different way. So we've looked at what already exists and we've thought about how we can build on what already exists in terms of the supply chain to really encourage people to be drawn into the sector with the promise of sustainable, well-paid work that goes on for decades. So we've done quite a lot of work on this. We've done studies, including this study, Missing Middle. We did this last year. It was quite a big piece of work. We looked at the industrial sectors in Cornwall. What we found from our modelling was that there's 4 really key parts of the sector for industrial growth in Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly. So those are, first of all, the operation and maintenance. So once the assets have been installed, you need people travelling in and out of ports close to the sites to go and service the assets, monitor them, replace parts, do routine maintenance, all that kind of stuff. You need good ports that are located close to the sites. Luckily, Cornwall has lots of those. So we've got lots of smaller ports that can support those smaller vessels running in and out all the time. So we're expecting to see real growth in that operation and maintenance space and some of the facilities onshore that support that as well. We've got concrete manufacture. So these platforms tend to be made of a mixture of concrete and steel. But we've got a really good supply chain of concrete already in the region, especially in Cornwall. We've got lots of aggregates lying around from China Clay Works and from mining works that could be used to support this manufacturing. We've also got a lot of expertise and specialist knowledge in the region about concrete and manufacturing processes. We've got the electrical competencies, so electrical cable, not just the manufacture, but also the maintenance, the testing, the quality assurance, and the innovation of electrical systems. There's good capacity already in the region to support that, lots of expertise, and again, lots of companies doing interesting stuff around that. And then the last one is the anchors and mooring lines, so all of the stuff that happens under the water to keep these turbines where they should be. Again, we've got companies that are already working in this space, in and around Falmouth and some of the other ports, doing lots of innovation, designing new solutions, looking at ways to bring the costs down, bring the reliability up, and deploy these assets in really challenging conditions. So there's already a good industry of that in Cornwall, and we expect to see quite a lot of growth in that. The types of competencies you need for that are, strong marine and mechanical engineering, but also the more commercial sides of it. So taking a project, taking an idea and turning it into a viable product that can be insured and deployed at scale. I was hoping one more thing would pop up there. So our modelling has indicated if we really threw everything at the wall and got these things up and running as much as we could and invested in the right opportunities at the right times, and we did lay out quite a lot of how you would do that in the report. So I'd encourage you to go and have a look if you're interested. We modelled that there would be in excess of 5,000 full-time equivalent roles in the next 20 years as a result of floating offshore wind. So if you really went to town and we invested in the right stuff at the right time, we could see a huge benefit, generational jobs for people in Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly. I've talked a lot about the technical aspects, so the kind of engineering and technical requirements for these projects. It's always worth considering as well, especially when we're engaging with young people who might not be particularly interested in the more technical side of things. These companies are enormous and they do huge amounts of work across a number of different areas. So they're not just engineering and technical companies. Generally, a project developer will employ a tier one contractor and they will have a huge breadth of stuff that they do that falls under these projects. Obviously, there's loads of legal requirements and legal services, so contracts and types of planning law and things like that. There's more site management, so onshore and offshore site management. Lots of project management comes into that, all of the health and safety, the compliance, lots of competencies that already exist in the region. We've got all the environmental work. So I do lots of work with young people studying environmental conservation, marine biology. There's all of the monitoring, studying the sites ahead of deploying assets, all of the ongoing monitoring around existing sites. Then there's stakeholder management. So all of the kind of public facing stuff that goes into building one of these projects. You want to put a turbine out at sea, you want to put a cable across someone's favorite bit of coastline, you're going to have to engage with the communities, run public events, do local group engagement, do lots of educational outreach, things like that. So we've seen good examples of that with projects in Cornwall already. One example that I always think of is the United Downs geothermal project. They did amazing educational outreach around that and local engagement, and it really benefited the project, brought value to the project, and really kind of promoted it in the local communities. Similar to that, all the marketing, and then we've got the business support. So lots of digital IT, cutting edge IT, AI, all of that stuff goes into offshore wind projects. Management, recruitment, training, all the normal stuff that you expect to see in a big company. And then all the planning, site surveys and all that stuff that goes into that part. So there's a real breadth of opportunity across different types of jobs and different types of interests for people who will come and work in this sector. So just to finish off, just to give some indication of the future pipeline, we've got those 3 orange sites, so those project development areas that I mentioned that are currently being leased. What we're seeing now is the Crown Estates starting to look to the future and to give some assurance to the supply chain that this is going to be a long-term generational opportunity that goes beyond just one commercial opportunity, one leasing round. So the Crown Estate have looked at the rest of the assets in the Celtic Sea, those green hatched areas, and they've said they would like to see up to just over 10% of those green areas be leased in the next 10 years after the first 3. So we're expecting to see quite a big pipeline of offshore wind moving south and west. Like I said, because we've now got these floating assets, we can start to look at sites much further offshore, where there's much deeper water, stronger wind resource, further from land. So lots of opportunities moving south and west. For Cornwall, that's a really good thing because we're going to see even more opportunity in this part of the world. We're the nearest bit of land to these projects. Companies are going to want to come here and work because they need access to those sites. So we are seeing that longer tail of opportunity now start to come up. This has been in the news quite a lot recently because it's encouraging to see the Crown Estate really putting their money right there and saying we want to develop this as a longer pipeline of opportunity. So I hope that has been a useful, quite rapid introduction. I wanted to leave some time for questions, so I'm going to come back out of this shared screen, and I hope some people have got some questions about floating wind.